In 2020, Ninjala took the world by storm, a ninja multiplayer action game for the Nintendo Switch that looked a bit like Splatoon but with bubblegum. With millions of downloads, the game skyrocketed immediately and became a huge success. But what nobody could have known at the time, that it would die out completely, just a few years later. Ninjala was shown for the first time at E3 2018 and quickly caught the interest of Nintendo fans. Stylish kids with oversized weapons, colorful explosions, and fast multiplayer action. Everything about it practically screamed Splatoon, only that it wasn't from Nintendo, but from Gung Ho Online Entertainment, the creators of the Puzzle & Dragons series. The trailer promised a brand new multiplayer experience where you fight with bubblegum weapons, run up walls, and perform ninja moves. Sounds crazy? Well, it was. But in a good way. That creativity was exactly what fascinated so many people back then. At a time when many multiplayer games were starting to feel similarly, Ninjala felt like something new and exciting. In Ninjala, up to 8 players take on the role of ninjas, who use supernatural abilities through their ninja bubblegum. The focus is on fast, close-range combat. You can run up walls, perform double jumps, and even disguise yourself as an object to surprise enemies. The bubblegum mechanic is one of the main features. Players can blow bubbles and fire them like projectiles, or use them for a short speed boost. A match lasts for 4 minutes, and the player or team with the most points from KOs wins, with finisher moves called Ippon granting extra points. The reactions to the first announcement were accordingly positive, especially among Nintendo fans. Many believed this could be the next big multiplayer hit on the Switch. Some even called it the next Splatoon, although that might have been a bit premature. But hey, this was in 2018, 1 year after the launch of the Switch. At that time, the console was in its absolute prime, and any exclusive multiplayer game automatically had the potential to blow up. Then came 2020 and the first beta tests. And that's when things got, well, let's say, difficult. The hype was enormous, and fans practically threw themselves at Ninjala. There were consequences. The servers were unstable, matches simply crashed, and many players couldn't even get into the game at all. It was the classic beta catastrophe that you always kind of expect, but still hope won't happen to yourself. But in the end, that's exactly what a beta is for, so it wasn't the end of the world. The most important thing was that fans were able to get a first impression of the game, and unfortunately, that impression wasn't entirely positive. While some people said that the gameplay at least felt interesting, others immediately started to doubt whether Ninjala was technically stable enough for an online game of this kind. Still, the core idea was good, and people remained optimistic, because the gameplay just had something unique. This mix between beat-em-up combat and parkour movement seemed at least exciting. And let's be honest, the idea of flying through the air with bubblegum and smacking people with ninja weapons does sound kind of fun, doesn't it? Expectations for the launch were high. Ninjala had attention, it had style, and it had, at least in theory, the potential to establish a brand new multiplayer franchise on the Switch. But like so often in life, things turned out differently. On June 24th, 2020, the time had finally come. After 2 years of hype, trailers, and beta tests, Ninjala officially launched. A new, cool, free-to-play multiplayer game exclusively for the Nintendo Switch. But just shortly after release, it became clear Ninjala had a rough start and couldn't quite live up to the massive hype. The servers, which already struggled during the beta, were still not much more stable now. Many players reported connection drops, lag, and extremely long matchmaking times. And even if you finally did get a match, the result was, well, not great. The gameplay was fast and chaotic, but also kind of unpolished. And players often had the impression that the outcome of the fight depended less on skill and more on pure luck. One of the biggest criticisms was the parry system. It worked like this. Both players chose one of 3 colors with the control stick, and each color was strong against one color and weak against another. And that system decided over entire fights. It was basically gambling, like rock, paper, scissors, and didn't have much to do with actual skill. Still, from a download perspective, the launch was very strong. Within the first 16 hours, it had already been downloaded 1 million times, and within a week, 2 million times. Those numbers were extremely impressive for a completely new game series, and showed just how big the hype was back then. But downloads aren't the same as active players. Many people tested the game briefly, only to realize it didn't really click for them. Within the community, opinions varied wildly. From "give them a chance" to "Ninjala is already dead," you could hear just about about everything. The media also was divided. Some praised the colorful style and the creative ideas, while others criticized the shallow gameplay and technical problems. So overall, the game had a very mixed reception among both the press and the players. What made it especially unfortunate was that many initially saw Ninjala as a real chance for a strong new multiplayer game on the Switch. But just a few weeks after launch, it already seemed clear. Ninjala was more of a flop. Player numbers started to drop, excitement faded, and the media barely wrote about it anymore. The dream of the next big Switch multiplayer game had burst before it even properly began. And this pattern can be seen in many games of this kind. A huge hype at launch, everyone tries it, the servers explode, and a few weeks later, the game is basically dead. And that's exactly what happened to Ninjala. In the first few days after launch, there was still excitement. People wanted to see what this colorful ninja game was all about. But after just a few weeks, that excitement dropped off rapidly. The player numbers began to fall, and quite significantly. Many people simply quit, because the game just didn't hold their interest long term. And that wasn't due to one single mistake, but many major problems. First, and probably most importantly, the gameplay. At first glance, it looked fun. Fast fights, cool moves, colorful effects. But many players immediately complained about poor balancing and a boring metagame. And the fact that luck played a pretty important part didn't help. If even hardcore players don't see a reason to improve, that's often deadly for an online game. Second, the amount of content. One of the biggest criticisms at launch was that there was barely any content. There were only 3 weapon types, few maps and modes, and the story mode was locked behind paid DLC, so most people never even got to experience it. And thirdly, the monetization problems. Ninjala was completely free to play, which of course meant that the developers had to make money somehow. The in-game shop was filled with microtransactions. The Ninjala Pass with level skips, a gacha lootbox system, and skins. Tons and tons of skins. In a review of the game, the author even pointed out that at launch, because the servers were so unstable, nothing in the game worked, except for the shop, which is kind of funny in its own way. All of that caused Ninjala to leave a bad first impression on many players. A cool and innovative concept, but too little content, bad servers, and tons of microtransactions in the in-game store. While Splatoon built a real culture around its community, tournaments and regular Splatfests, with Ninjala, basically nothing happened. Sure, there were events, updates and even crossovers with well-known franchises, but they felt more like desperate attempts to regain attention rather than something that genuinely excited people. YouTubers and streamers also only stuck around briefly. Many made 1 or 2 videos at launch and then never again. On Twitch, the game was barely present, and anyone who did stream it usually only had a handful of viewers. The interest disappeared faster than it appeared, and so what was once imagined as the next big Switch multiplayer title became something most people only vaguely remembered. A game that started out loud and colorful, and then just quietly and quickly vanished. But the developer studio Gung Ho didn't give up. They genuinely tried to keep the game alive. With new seasons, cosmetic items and crossover events, they attempted to bring people back. Despite sinking player numbers, despite criticism, and despite the noticeably fading interest, the team tried everything to revive Ninjala. And when I say everything, I really mean everything. Shortly after release, they launched Season 1, followed by many more seasons that regularly introduced new weapons, maps, outfits, and events. They wanted it to be a classic live service title, similar to Fortnite or the often mentioned Splatoon. But the problem was, the hype was long gone, and the players just didn't return. Over time, more people gave the game a chance. By October 2020, the 2 million downloads had become 5 million, and by early 2021, 6 million. But despite that, the game still didn't feel super active. In a desperate attempt to win players back, Gung Ho then relied on crossover events. And to be fair, Gung Ho really went all out here. Sonic the Hedgehog, Demon Slayer, Monster Hunter, Attack on Titan. Ninjala had some massive crossover collabs, but they didn't necessarily seem all that effective. In the game itself, these crossovers were often nothing more than a few skins and emotes. Maybe interesting for people who had already played it, but not nearly enough of a reason to come back. However, they seemed to have a positive effect in Japan in particular, and managed to attract some players there. In general, the game seemed to be a bit more successful in Japan, and it even got its own anime, which is still getting new episodes. episodes. Seriously, how has this anime gotten close to 200 episodes? Overall though, the player base stayed small, the community remained mostly inactive, and the big crossovers that were supposed to generate attention usually died out within a few days. And so Ninjala ended up in the same place as many games of this type. It became a title that was still ongoing, but hardly anyone actually cared about anymore. A game that still often received updates, but most people didn't even know that it was happening. Ninjala was still alive, but honestly, have you guys heard much about it? Let me know in the comments. And when a game reaches that point, not even cool skins from other big franchises can save it anymore. And then they did something that, in my opinion, completely destroyed the game. They made it pay to win. I already mentioned that Ninjala had monetization issues before, but when they added the so-called Ninja Gum Lab in Season 9 at the beginning of 2022, they gave players the option to make their weapons even stronger, if they paid extra. Technically, you could unlock these upgrades by playing normally, but it was obviously much slower. On top of that, the game became completely unappealing for new players, since longtime players now had a clear advantage. Within the community, many complained that the developers had completely destroyed the already bad game balance with the Ninja Gum Lab. And both casual fans and hardcore players agreed that the system was awful. It was essentially Gung Ho's last desperate attempt to squeeze money out of the game before giving up on it completely. And that's when the game's slow fall into irrelevance began. The developers' desperate attempts to keep the game alive with new updates and crossovers failed. Since 2023, barely 3 years after release, the game was widely considered to be dead by the community. And then, in August of this year, the following message finally appeared. Thank you for playing Ninjala. The Ninjala team has an announcement regarding the duration of Season 21. In order to provide all Ninjala users with an enjoyable experience and stable service over the long term, we have decided Season 21 will run indefinitely. In other words, the servers will continue, but the game will no longer receive new content. And for a live service game, that's essentially a death sentence. I don't think there are many games that show how thin the line between success and being forgotten is as Ninjala. A game that had it all. A creative idea, a cool style, and the perfect platform to grow. Over 11 million people gave the game a chance over the years, but it failed to keep almost anyone engaged, and not even all the crossovers could save it. Then the developers essentially buried the game themselves by making it pay to win, making it inaccessible to new players, while also driving away the last few hardcore fans that were still playing. So in the end, there's one major lesson to learn from Ninjala, that even promising, innovative games with millions of downloads are only as strong as their ability to keep players invested long term. And that is exactly why Ninjala failed.